All right, so gonna go ahead and move into Unit 4 now with the new nation. So we've had the Revolution, we have had the Articles of Confederation, we've had the Constitution. Now, how are we actually going to run this new country? So George Washington became president. He was unanimously elected the very first president of the United States. And he was president from 1789 to 1796. So he served 2 terms as president. While he was president, he helped to establish the Judiciary Act of 1789, which set up a court system for the United States. So the Constitution only set up, okay, you will have a judiciary, but it didn't say what, like, it didn't really go in depth. So this set up the Supreme Court, 3 circuit courts, and 13 district courts. John Jay was named the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is the leader of the Supreme Court. And the U.S. Attorney and U.S. Marshal were created to serve as the prosecutor and the police for making sure that these laws were interpreted correctly. So the focus of the judiciary system is to have the meanings of federal law, treaties, and conflicts between state and federal law heard within district courts. And it ensured that federal judges had the final say over the Constitution, and making sure that, laws were actually legal and things that the president did were actually legal. This is part of that whole checks and balances system and separation of powers. As for immigration and naturalization, the Constitution required Congress to create policies for this stuff. So GW believed that the U.S. should always serve as a refuge for the oppressed. So Congress came up with the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said any free white person could gain citizenship or naturalization after living at least 2 years in the U.S. This was increased to 5 years in 1795. And individual states were allowed to decide about people of African or Asian descent. The reason that they did not include them in the original Naturalization Act is because they did not want to alienate the southern states. Good old slavery and racism. The children of immigrants were immediately granted birthright citizenship, which means if you are born here in the United States, you are automatically given citizenship to the United States. Now, Alexander Hamilton, remember that he is head of the Treasury, Secretary of Treasury, and he comes up with this whole financial plan. And the first part of it is the Report on Public Credit, which said that the U.S. national government should pay all debts, whether they were state debts or national debts. And I mean, think about it. We owed people money after the American Revolution, especially the French. And Hamilton wanted the assumption of state debts to tighten the link between state and national government. Some states, especially Virginia, had already paid their debts, and they were opposed to the government assuming those debts because they were like, well, we already paid our debts, and this isn't fair to us because we already paid it, and we think everybody else should have to pay it too. So, if you have seen the musical Hamilton, you will know that this is the basis for the song "The Room Where It Happens," and basically a lot of political things happen in a closed door meeting, and Virginia finally agreed to have the national government pick up all of the debts if they would place the new capital on the Potomac River close by to Virginia instead of all the way up in New York City or all the way in Philadelphia. Hamilton said, fine, I don't care as long as we get the national credit built up. Fine, done. So that was a huge win for Jefferson and Hamilton on both sides, because they both kind of got what they wanted. Now, with this, we have interpretation of the Constitution. What can you or can't you do with what is written in the Constitution? Because it was written pretty vaguely. Yeah, it's specific about certain things, but then on the other hand, it's a little bit vague so that it can be a living document and adjust as the country gets older. So with this, Hamilton wanted a national bank, known as the Bank of the United States, as part of his financial plan, to be jointly owned with private stockholders. The bank would serve as a way for the government to collect taxes. It would provide a safe place to keep the nation's money. It would lend the government and businesses money when they needed it. It would create a paper currency that would be common amongst all the states. Well, I know you're going to be shocked by this. Jefferson and Madison were against it. They wanted the country to be based on farmers, not merchants or bankers, and they said the bank was unconstitutional. So Jefferson and Madison looked at the Constitution strictly. They said that since the Constitution did not specifically mention a bank, the national government couldn't do it. So they said that all powers not specifically given to the national government were reserved for the states, and this is the foundation for states' rights philosophy. Hamilton, on the other side of it, argued that government can do anything necessary and proper to run itself, which is a broad or loose interpretation of the Constitution. So Hamilton said, well, the Constitution said we can borrow money, regulate trade and currency, and these would be done by a bank. So he says that this is an implied power from the Constitution. And he wanted to use this as a basis for a strong central government. Washington ended up siding with Hamilton on this one, and he signed the bank bill into law with a 20-year charter. He said, okay, let's give this 20 years, see if it works. So what did the Bank of the U.S. do? They had three main responsibilities: to hold the government's funds and pay its bills, provide loans to the federal government and other banks to promote economic development, and manage the country's money supply by regulating the power of state chartered banks to issue paper currency known as banknotes. We also see the rise of political parties with this whole states versus national. Now, remember how I said factions existed before parties. Back before the war, we had the Whigs and the Tories. After the war and with the Constitutional Convention, we had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. These were not political parties. These were political factions. Factions are formed for an issue. Parties are permanent organizations, or as permanent as you can get. Political parties came out in opposition to Hamilton's policies. They were like, whoa, pause. You want a lot of national government power. Washington hated political parties. He wanted the governors to be guided by patriotism. He thought that political parties would be unpatriotic and divisive. And I mean, he wasn't entirely wrong about that whole divisive thing. So the Federalists are one political party. This was led by Alexander Hamilton and supported mostly by Northerners. They favored a strong central government and economic growth. They had little faith in the masses of the people. They tended to be wealthier, and they favored rule by the wealthy, educated elite. They also supported England and were afraid of the French Revolution. Well, on the other side of things, we have the Democratic Republicans. These were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were mostly Southern supported. They disliked cities. They disliked factories. They doubted wage workers had economic or political independence to maintain Republican ideals. Basically, both parties thought the common man was an idiot, but the Democratic Republicans were like, well, no, we're the champions of the common man, and we prefer the smaller populations where people get to know each other, small towns, agriculture. Um, they believed that America would provide food for Europe, and then Europe would provide manufactured goods in return, and it's a nice balanced system. They were afraid of a strong central government, and they ended up supporting France more often than not. So you have your two major political parties at this time, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, the French Revolution, you should remember from previously, the middle class and the poor revolted against the French king. And there's a whole lot of drama there I'm not getting into. But then the French tried to spread the revolution to other countries. America had to decide if it would support France because we were like, well, France helped us, and this is kind of a continuation of our ideals from the revolution. Some Federalists opposed this, mobocracy in the French Revolution, and the Federalists favored Britain instead of France due to economic and political concerns. Like, hey, we're kind of new and young here. We don't have a whole lot of money. We don't want to destroy our 10-year-old country. In 1792, France then invaded Austria to spread the revolution, which made it a republic, which made France more popular in the US. But then, the Reign of Terror came in 93, and, the guillotine turned a lot of people off. And they were like, hard pass, France. Hard pass. So, we declared neutrality. Britain was dragged into war. We originally joined the Franco-American alliance with the revolution. We said we would help defend them. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were like, yeah, let's support France. Washington didn't believe we could survive it. Hamilton supported Washington in this one. So the U.S. ultimately declared neutrality. It fed into the U.S. tendency towards isolation from European affairs, and it also economically allowed U.S. merchants to trade with both sides in the war, and America was able to take over the Caribbean sugar trade. Now, we were starting to get really ticked off with Britain, too. Britain refused to give up any of their forts in the Northwest that they said they would at the end of the Revolution, because Britain wanted to continue their Great Lakes fur trade. So they helped to build an Indian nation as a buffer with Canada, because remember, Canada was largely French at this point. Britain also wanted to starve the French West Indies with a blockade, but guess what? That also meant that they stopped American ships. And when they did that, they would impress or imprison American soldiers and force them into the British Navy. The French were like, hey, U.S., you're supposed to help defend us. And the U.S. was like, hey, we don't want to go into the British Navy. This isn't our thing. We got away from them. So a lot of Americans argued for another war with Britain. Hamilton wanted peace with Britain to protect American trade. Money. Hamilton's big focus. Meanwhile, in America, we had a national government putting tax on whiskey. Well, whiskey was a commodity to drink, whatever, but it was also used as a medium of exchange in case you didn't have the paper money. It was used for trade. So farmers in southwestern Pennsylvania revolted against this tax, and it was known as the Whiskey Rebellion. They used similar techniques like the Sons of Liberty and the Shayshites. They even had a motto, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, inspired by the French Revolution. Washington had to step in and stop the rebellion with the militia. It proved that the national government was strong, unlike in Shays' rebellion. So this is a positive proof of a strong national government at this point. Now, Jay and Pinckney. So Chief Justice John Jay was sent to London in 94 to make a treaty with Britain. They were unable to get Britain to agree to much. England did agree to leave their forts in the Northwest, just like they did in 83. Britain agreed to pay for the seizure of ships. They also refused to stop future impressments. And Britain also got the US to commit to repaying all of their debt from the war. A lot of the public was, pretty angry about this. It strengthened the position of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, and the treaty was like, there was this feeling of betrayal by the South, and that we were surrendering to Britain, while the South had to pay the debts and the North got repaid for their lost ships. Then came Pinckney, because Spain got involved. So Spain was afraid that the US was getting closer with England, not with Spain. It's basically high school. So they offered a treaty giving the US pretty much everything the US wanted. They gave the US access to the Mississippi River. They agreed to a border between Florida and the US. And they said that the US could use New Orleans as a cargo transfer point. These are huge things. So this created a sense of security for America, and it helped to recognize the borders. And both of these treaties ultimately kept the US out of European war. Now, Washington, as he ended his terms, he refused to serve a third term. So he established the farewell address. And in it, he warned against a bunch of different things, including serving a third term. He thought that 2 terms was plenty for any president. He warned against sectionalism, so divisiveness between different areas of the country. He also warned against secession, aka leaving the United States. He warned against political parties because he saw that it would become the downfall of the US. And he also said that the US should avoid entangling alliances with other countries. Now, what that means is he didn't want permanent treaties. He favored temporary treaties with other nations. If you permanently get involved, then you're in every single battle, war, whatever, that the other country's involved in. And that's not such a great thing for a new country to get involved in. So we have to have an election of 1796 to get a new president. So our candidates, we had Alexander Hamilton made way too many enemies, putting his financial plan in place to be considered a viable Federalist candidate. So John Adams became the Federalist candidate. He was very qualified to be president, but he was pretty unpopular. He had a rough personality. He was a big jerk. He was suspected to favor a more monarchical type of government, so more like a monarchy, king. Hamilton and Adams hated each other, which divided the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and he used the Whiskey Rebellion and Jay's Treaty against the Federalists and was like, hey, this is why I should be president. This is why the Democratic Republicans should take over. The campaign became really personal and nasty and very attacking of one another. Don't think that nasty politics is a recent phenomenon. Oh no, it was going on back then. Adams ultimately won the election, and since Jefferson came in second, he became the vice president because that's how the Constitution was written. First place gets president, second place gets vice president. We're going to see how this causes issues in the future. So one of the first things that Adams gets involved in is the XYZ Affair. France was upset by Jay's Treaty, so they seized U.S. ships and didn't accept the U.S. envoy to France. Adams ended up sending 3 diplomats to try to improve relations with France. The 3 French officials that met with them demanded a bribe and a loan for the privilege of talking to the French foreign minister, and the American ministers refused to pay and returned home. This is known as the XYZ Affair. So then we get involved in a quasi-war. It was an unofficial war with France. The U.S. started to prepare for war. We created a Navy department. The Marines were reinstated. The U.S. canceled all treaties with France. And then that ultimately came to nothing. The Convention of 1800, France had been fighting most of Europe. Napoleon had taken power. He wanted peace. He didn't want to deal with the Americas. It was not what he wanted. So the Franco-American Treaty was ended. the US agreed to pay all their debts to France, and it basically left us just, we're not enemies. Then came the Alien and Sedition Acts, unfortunately, what Adams would probably be known most for. Federalists passed laws to minimize the influence of the Jeffersonians or Democratic Republicans. The Alien Act increased the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years in order to vote, which made a lot of people really mad because they lost their right to vote. And the president was given the power to deport foreigners in peace or wartime. So basically, if you were a foreigner and you annoyed the president, you could be deported. Then came the Sedition Act, who said anyone who impedes the policies of government or falsely defames government officials, including the president, could be fined or imprisoned. Basically, Adams wanted to silence the critics. So if you spoke out against the president or any government official, you could be thrown in jail. Yeah, turned a lot of people against the Federalists. Not so great of an idea for Adams and the Federalists. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were written because they were afraid of more constitutional rights being lost, the establishment of a one-party dictatorship. So Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolution, Madison wrote the Virginia resolution to explain the states' rights position under the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Democratic Republicans argued that the U.S. was a compact or an agreement between states and the national government. And Federalists argued that the people, not the states, created this compact. So no other states adopted similar resolutions, but it shows that everything wasn't all nice and happy and rainbows during Adams's presidency. So we come into the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the U.S. after the House of Representatives had to decide the election. So you had a tie of Jefferson getting 73 electoral votes and Aaron Burr getting 73 electoral votes. And then John Adams got 65. And Pinckney got 64. John Jay got 1. Not really going to get into those. It was the first time that the House of Representatives had to decide an election. It took days to decide it. And it's not the last time that the House of Reps had to decide an election. We see it later in history with Jackson versus John Quincy Adams and Hayes versus Tilden. So we see this happening in the future as well, which is exactly what the Constitution wrote it for. So after realizing there was a flaw in the Electoral College, Congress had to fix the flaw by passing the 12th Amendment in the Constitution, which calls for having the electors cast the same ballot for president and vice president instead of, first place gets president, second place gets vice president. This created this whole concept of the presidential ticket. So that's why now you'll vote for president and vice president. So for example, in the 2020 election, you voted for Trump and Pence, president, vice president, or you voted for Biden and Harris. That is the presidential ticket.